This is the story of Esther. It is a story of a young girl who was courageous and risked her life to save her people. It is such a special story. There is a whole book in the Bible about her, the book of Esther. Many, many years after King Saul and King David, and 500 years before Jesus was born, there was a great kingdom of Persia that stretched across the Middle East from North Africa. There are still ruins left of their great and powerful civilization. The kingdom had scholars that studied science, armies to protect them, and many cities filled with people. They had fantastic buildings. Archaeologists that study the ruins can help us picture what it might have looked like. Can you see the king painted on the base of the building in the middle? He's sitting on his throne. The kings ruling over this kingdom had control of everything: money, power, and they could decide who lived and who died. They lived in palaces with plenty of food and entertainment. See the scepter he is holding in his hand? It is a symbol of power. Not everyone lived in a beautiful palace. Many people lived in cramped houses. This is more like what Esther's home would have looked like, and this is where Esther's story begins. This is Esther. She was part of the family of the people of God, and they had been driven into exile and captured by the Persian army. They were forced to live in Persia. It was not safe for the people of God to live in Persia. And this is Esther with her older cousin Mordecai. They were trapped in Persia and did not have power or money. Esther was living with Mordecai because her parents had died, and he became like a father to her. They lived in the city of Susa, where the Persian king Xerxes had his palace. This is King Xerxes. One day, the king invited all his officials to a large banquet and ordered his queen to appear. But the queen refused to appear, and so she was banished from the kingdom. But now we needed a new queen. So King Xerxes had all the unmarried young women brought to the palace so he could choose a queen from among them. When the king saw Esther, he thought she was the most beautiful one, so he had her prepared to become the new queen. And she was crowned Queen Esther and was taken to live in the palace. But Mordecai warned Esther that it was dangerous to be Jewish in Persia, and so Esther kept it a secret that she was one of the people of God. Each day, Mordecai came to sit by the palace gate to send messages to Queen Esther and to receive back her news. This is Haman. Haman was the most important person in Persia after King Xerxes. Haman had a lot of hate inside, and he especially hated all the people of God. Everyone in Susha was supposed to bow down in front of Haman because he was important. But the people of God did not bow down to anyone except God. Mordecai refused to bow down before Haman because he said he was one of the people of God. This made Haman hate Mordecai even more. The palace is a busy place, and every day people are coming and going. Mordecai observed it all. One day, while Mordecai was sitting at the gate, he overheard a plot to kill King Xerxes. Mordecai sent a message to Esther about the plot, and Esther was able to tell King Xerxes the message from Mordecai, and so the life of the king was saved. This good act by Mordecai was recorded in the king's records by a scribe. Each day Haman passed by Mordecai, and he still would not bow. This made Haman so furious that he decided to write a law to have all the Jewish families killed. He cast lots, called pur, to set the month and day when the killings would take place. And he wrote this month and day in his law. Haman took his law to King Xerxes so the king could seal the law with his ring. And then Haman had copies posted and read throughout the kingdom. In all the king's provinces, all Jews, young and old, women and children, are to be destroyed and killed, and their goods plundered on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar. When Mordecai read the law, he and all the people of God in Susa put on sackcloth and covered their head with ashes and fasted and mourned. This helped them pray to God in their time of need. Then Mordecai sent a message to Esther, and he asked Esther to go before the king and ask him to get rid of the law. Esther sent word back to Mordecai that she could not go before the king because if anybody went to the king and the king had not first sent for them, they would be killed. Mordecai sent back another message to Esther. He said, Esther, you will die with your people unless you act. Maybe you were made queen for such a time as this. Then Esther agreed to go before the king if the people of God would continue to fast and pray for her for 3 more days. After praying, Esther was still very afraid. She might die if the king rejected her. She also knew her people would be killed if she did not act. And so she made a plan and appeared before the king without an invitation in his hallway. Would he lift his scepter to her, or would she die? And King Xerxes, when he saw her, held out his scepter and called her to come in and welcome. Esther would not be killed. Esther asked King Xerxes if he and Haman would come to a special dinner that she would prepare for them that evening. The king gladly agreed. After the meal, the king told Esther she could ask for anything that she wanted, and he would give it to her, even if she asked for half of his kingdom. Esther said she would make her request the next evening if the king and Haman would return for another dinner, and they agreed. Haman was happy when he left the dinner, but when he came out through the palace gate, he saw Mordecai, who would not bow down before him, and Haman became angrier. Haman went home to his family and friends and bragged about his great wealth and how all the palace officials respected him and how he was the only one that Queen Esther invited to dinner with the king. But then he said, "But I still can't be happy as long as I see Mordecai, who will not respect me." Haman decided to build a tower and asked the king the next day to hang Mordecai from it. That night, the king could not sleep. He had a servant read to him from the record book of the kingdom. And when the servant read the part about how Mordecai was the one who had saved the king's life when he learned of the plot to kill the king realized Mordecai had never received any reward for saving his life. The king decided to honor Mordecai. The next morning, Haman then went before the king to convince him to hang Mordecai. But before Haman could even ask the king to hang Mordecai, the king asked Haman what Haman thought the best way was to honor someone. Now, Haman immediately thought that the person the king wanted to honor must be him. And so he told the king to have him led through the streets of Susa, riding on the king's horse, with a royal cape, led by an official who would announce, "This is how the king honors a man." Haman's suggestion pleased the king, and so King Xerxes ordered Haman to do all that for Mordecai. As Haman led Mordecai in honor through the streets of Susa, saying, "This is how the king honors a man," he felt deeply shamed. He hated Mordecai more and more. That evening, Esther continued her plan and had a second dinner for the king and Haman. Now she needed to make her request to the king, and again she was afraid as she feared the king's powers over her. She told the king that she was a Jew and asked him to save her people from being killed. The king then realized it was Haman who had made this cruel law, and he became angry at Haman. Haman begged Esther to save him, but King Xerxes ordered Haman to be hung on the gallows that Haman had made for Mordecai, and he was taken away by the guards. Then the king brought Mordecai to the palace and made Mordecai the highest official in the kingdom. And he gave Mordecai permission to make a law that would save the people of God. Mordecai wrote this law and had it sealed by the king, and quickly sent it to be read and posted in all the provinces and in Susa. And it said, "On the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month, the Jews in every city and province will be allowed to get together and defend themselves." And the people of God were able to defend themselves and defeat their enemies. And then they celebrated. Then Mordecai and Esther sent letters to the Jews everywhere throughout the world, telling them to celebrate this victory for 2 days every year, forever and ever. It would be called Purim. Each year, you must celebrate on the day when we Jews defeated our enemies. Remember this time when our sorrow was turned to joy. Celebrate by having parties, giving to the poor, and by sharing gifts of food with each other. Now, every year, the Jewish people still celebrate Purim by having parties, giving to the poor, and sharing food. They especially enjoy games in which they spin the dreidel with the Hebrew letters, which begin each word of their grateful statement of faith. A great miracle happened here. And it all started with Esther.